So, I was assigned medieval clothing for my project for this intro thing. So let's talk about that. So, as for the basics, so the clothes were made from wool back then, and undergarments were made from linen to keep everybody cool. The class determined how clothes were made and how much you owned. So it determined like what kind of fabrics you could buy, what kind of patterns, how like ornate your clothing was, and how much clothes you owned. So like if you owned a ton of clothes for like spring, summer, winter, or if you kept getting new clothes because old clothes were going out of fashion, that was kind of like how class played into it. Um, some jobs also determined what you were allowed to wear, not just at work, but also around the city, because they were seen as like lower class, so they weren't allowed to wear certain fabrics or certain jewelry or stuff like that. Um, the outer clothes were rarely washed, which seems kind of weird, but they believed that the smoke from like their firewood acted as a natural deodorant and it made them smell good, so they never really washed their outer clothes. But the underclothes were frequently washed because, sweat and stuff. It's gross. Um, Everybody wore a lot of hats, and like literally everyone wore hats. Not even kidding. And then the government decided laws about the clothing, so like who could wear what was allowed in certain places, stuff like that. Very much controlling, like they are today. Um, as for men's clothes, they wore a lot of stockings and tunics. Noblemen wore jackets instead. Sometimes they wore leggings. A lot of the times they wore pants underneath their shirts and their jackets over top of the leggings. They also sometimes wore furs and jewelry, even though that was most of the time conserved for the women of the noble class. They still wore them sometimes because, it showed wealth and stuff. So the man on the top there, he is more of like a average, like middle to lower class man in the dress. And then the guy on the bottom over here is definitely a nobleman. He's got a lot of jewelry, a big cape, very puffy, very big, trying to make it seem like he's a big person. He matters a lot. As for women, women wore a lot of long gowns with sleeveless tunics underneath. They also wore wimples, which covered their hair. It was like a piece of fabric that they wrapped around their head, almost like a hood of a type. Um, Noble women wore flowing gowns, so they had a lot of bigger, more ornate things. They also wore a lot of elaborate headpieces, so like things shaped like butterflies. They had a lot of gold, a lot of jewels. They're very embellished, like very rich looking. Like it makes me think of carpets in mansions, like very much patterns and like different fabrics and textures and stuff like that. So for the undergarments, they were pretty much the same both ways. A lot of everybody wore shirts or undertunics, so like longer undershirts type things. They wore stockings or leggings underneath their clothes, and everybody wore underpants, as you do. Also, the leather boots that a lot of the people wore covered in wooden pattens to keep their feet dry when they worked outside if the weather wasn't very forgiving. Okay, so a lot of the times when you hear about dyes on fabrics, it's the case of like, oh, well, the lower class can't really afford it because they're lavish and they're expensive and it takes a lot to make. But at this time, dyes were a lot more common because they could be made out of natural substances like flowers and herbs. Um, the bolder and brighter shades costed more just because they took more time and more resources to produce. It took them longer to like sit and soak into the fabric. It also took a lot more of like chemicals to get it to stick. So most of the time, bolder, brighter colors were going to be found on the noble people. Silk was one of the most luxurious fabrics out there at the time. Everybody wanted silk because it was imported, it was soft, it was breathable, everybody liked it. But because it was so luxurious, only upper class and churchmen could afford it because it was very like lavish. Classes determined clothing in the sense that like you could only wear certain things or how you got it. So with the lower class, women sheared their own sheeps and spun it into thread themselves to make clothes for the whole family, not just themselves. And then the upper class, of course, had clothes made for them. They had a lot more elaborate styles. They followed a lot of the current fashions, so they were very trendy, as we would say today. They had a lot of garments lined with fur to keep them warm and to be soft. Lavish imported jewelry from other countries with a lot of gems. Brooches and diamonds were very popular, but at this time, gemstones were not polished or cut, so they were very much like raw gems. And then they garnished their clothes with silver to make it seem like ornate and a lot of patterns and stuff. Also, knights were not allowed to wear rings or any type of jewelry while they were at work, being knights. I don't think they were allowed to wear them during the normal times either. So the Holy Order wore long woolen habits, which is kind of like what nuns wear, like hat, hood things, as an emulation of Roman clothing, not Russian, Roman. Um, they decided that monks' clothing should be plain but comfortable, and they were only allowed to wear linen to keep their heads warm. So they could wear like linen hats to keep them warm, but the rest of their clothing had to be like very breathable, like cotton type things. And then, depending on the job you had in the church, was what color your clothes were. So, like, kind of like cardinals and the Pope in the Catholic Church, like cardinals wear red, the Pope wears white, same kind of system at the time. So, like I said earlier, everybody wears hats. Don't know why, I think it's kind of weird, but everybody wears hats. Um, a lot of people wore them to like convey their jobs. A lot of people wore them to make fashion statements if they were richer. It was a very huge insult to a person if you knocked off their hat. It was seen as very rude, and it was a very like bad thing to do back then. So the men's hats were more like wide brim straw hats. They had a lot of close fitting linen or hemp hats that tied under the chin with strings. They also had a variety of felt caps, a lot of the like sweat wicking type, I'm at work and I can keep working with this hat on hats. Women wore veils and wimples. Again, wimples are like fabrics that cover the hair and the head, almost like a hood. And then you know what veils are. And then both of them did wear hoods. Sometimes the hoods were attached to capes or jackets. And most of the time it was used like weather permitting, kind of like protection against sun or wind or something. Sumptuary laws are where it gets interesting. So these were laws imposed by the government to curb the expenditure of people. So they wanted to control what everyone was wearing. The violations were definitely punished on different levels. It could be anywhere from like a fine to losing your class title. You could lose your job. You could even die if it was serious enough. The rules were based on gender, social class, jobs, and family relations. So that was like the regulations for who could wear what. And then the legislation of 1363, a lot of the rules were very like strict, such as women had to be dressed according to the position of their fathers or husbands. Wives and daughters of servants couldn't wear veils above 12 pence in value, so they didn't want servants' wives or daughters to be wearing expensive things. Handicraftsmen and yeomen's wives could not wear silk veils. Again, money. The use of fur confined to ladies of knights. So only ladies who were with knights could wear fur, and it was only if their knight had a rental above 200 marks a year. So if they were above 200 marks a year as a knight, they were allowed to wear fur. Their wives or their ladies were. Again, the wife or daughter of a knight could not wear cloth of gold or sable fur. So those, again, were restricted for noble people, higher class church people. Wives and daughters of knights could not wear velvet. They could not. Wives and daughters of an esquire or gentleman could not wear velvet, satin, or ermine. Again, most of these are like, these are too lavish for you, lower class people. What I thought was interesting were wives and daughters of laborers could not wear clothes beyond a certain price or girdle garnished with silver. So they had to have clothes that were cheaper, but they didn't get to decide. It was like the government's decision, and it was not a regulation. So whoever was judging them that day could choose if they thought it was too expensive. There was no like solid line. And then cloth of gold and purple silk were combined to women of the royal family. So like again, purple was like royalty, power. Gold is very wealthy, a lot of support, wanting to look rich. And then the importation of silk and lace by Lombards and other foreigners was forbidden. So they could not import silk or lace without like permission from the government, which I think is really weird, but it makes a lot of sense because they didn't want people to like dress out of their social class, if that makes sense.